Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here with Alex Edmans, Professor of Finance at London Business School. Alex will need no introduction to our viewers and is a leading light of academia on all matters relating to responsible business and ESG, and makes a point not just of undertaking academic research of the highest quality, but also making insights from that research available to practitioners through his teaching, blogs, books, and other prolific outreach activities. So, Alex, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on. Looking forward to our conversation.
So we're here to talk about the articles that Harald Walkate and I wrote on does sustainable investing work. But before we get into that, I'd like to get your perspectives on the higher order question. What is sustainable investing?
Well, this is a great question. And I know people always say, oh, that's a great question. But this is truly a good question because there's so much written and said about sustainable investing without actually defining it. So I'm now serving on the Responsible Investing Global Future Council of the World Economic Forum. And before we did anything, we thought that the first thing that our Global Future Council should do is to define sustainable investing, because unless we do this, we don't know what we need to do for the rest of our council term. So what we came up with is a definition, which you can find on the WEF website. We've said sustainable investing is the incorporation of environmental and social factors to achieve one or more of the following outcomes: financial returns, societal impact, and values alignment. So let me pick that apart. So first we say it's the incorporation of environmental and social factors. Why that? Haven't we missed something? Haven't we missed governance? But governance to us is not sustainable investing, even though it's lumped with ES in terms of this ESG acronym, because we think governance is just investing, period. Right? So nearly everybody believes that governance matters for a company's long-term returns. You don't need to really care about societal impact to take governance into account. But where the controversy is should you take environmental and social factors into account? Some argue should, and some argue you shouldn't. Why might you want to take these into account? First is the financial returns motive, which is the one of the three objectives that I highlighted. It could be that you believe that your impact on wider society will ultimately bounce back and affect you in the long term, either through government regulation or through customer actions or employee motivation. But no, not everybody believes that. There are some people who believe that your impact on wider society is truly an externality, and so there's companies that can get away with emitting negative externalities without any repercussions. So it's far from a foregone conclusion that people will use environmental and social factors to achieve the pursuit of financial returns. And indeed, you and I and Dirk Genter are currently working on a paper where we surveyed asset managers, and certainly far from everybody believes that. But there's the two other objectives, which are societal impact and values alignment. So societal impact is the reason for incorporating environmental and social factors is you think that this will not only achieve financial returns for you, but change society. So maybe I'm providing capital to companies that emit positive externalities and starving some fossil fuel companies of capital. And finally, there's values alignment, which is even if I don't have an impact, it just makes me feel good about the world. For example, I might not think that divesting from tobacco companies will stop them being in operation, because if I sell, somebody else buys, but I just think it's morally wrong for me to earn dividends and capital gains from a company which is globalizing tobacco, and so that's a different reason. And why I think it's so important to have that taxonomy is that when we think about does sustainable investing work or not, which I know that we're going to talk about, we need to think about does it work in relation to the objectives that it has. So it may well be that sustainable investing could achieve societal impact, but maybe that's at the expense of financial returns. And this means that often when you have newspaper articles looking at the financial performance of ESG funds or not, that might not actually be getting at the ultimate goal, at least for some investors, which might be societal impact or values alignment.
I think that's a really helpful framework. And I mean, in the articles that we wrote, I think we focused on the second one of those very much, which was societal impact. And in part, that's because it's what a lot of people seem to think they're expecting of sustainable investing, and particularly if we look at the expectations that are being put on asset owners to address externalities such as climate change. So we're very much focusing on that middle dimension of societal impact. And we used a three-stage rocket analogy to describe what needs to be true for sustainable investing to have real world impact. And I'll put a link in the show notes to give for more detail of this. But in summary, we find that traditional sustainable investing techniques, especially in public markets, struggle to make it through all three stages of the rocket analogy. So, for example, divesting from oil companies may have an impact on cost of equity, but it's small and maybe too small for managers to notice or act on. Or if managers do act on it and they produce less oil or gas as a result, a competitor or state-owned actor may just pick up the slack. So at the system level, it doesn't create an impact. I'd like to get your reactions to what we've done. So maybe to start off, what did we get right?
I think you got virtually everything right. I'm not just saying this because you're interviewing me, but I have independently, way before I knew that I'd be interviewed, shared this on my LinkedIn. I've discussed this model in other podcasts that I've been on. So I think it's a really good model. I think what you got right was that we need many things to be on operation for sustainable investing to have a system-wide impact. So it's not just enough for us to feel good and to think that we're doing the right thing, because it might still have limited impact. You can still be achieving your values, but values alignment is different from societal impact. So going to this idea that we must divest from fossil fuels, and that to many people is the main way in which you invest sustainably. Often as an investor, you might get sometimes cancelled for holding fossil fuel stocks. But that requires a number of things. Firstly, stage one is it requires you selling to affect the cost of capital, when if you sell, maybe other investors buy and there's no effect on cost of capital. Number two, it has to be that the cost of capital effects on the company will actually affect the company's decisions. And so there is some evidence suggesting that even if cost of capital effects are even as large as 50 basis points, this is pretty much a rounding error. So this is really small compared to the main driver of investment decisions, which is the expected cash flows. And that depends on things such as likely government action. So government action is much more first order than small changes to the cost of capital. And number three, as you highlight, even if the company in question is to change, maybe there's going to be responses from other companies. So let's say the oil and gas company that you invest in is not going to expand. Well, maybe that creates an opportunity for another company to expand instead. So even if your company is being affected, it could be that there's a response from other companies which neutralizes it. So I think this is really important. And this is not because you or Harold or I are anti-sustainable investing. We all believe that it is really important for investors to have these other objectives and to be able to try to achieve these objectives, but just to know, well, what are the effective ways in which you achieve these objectives? And if indeed it is difficult to have societal impact, then maybe as an investor, you should be trying to choose funds that achieve more financial returns or values alignment if those are more realistic than the societal impact objective.
And is there anything you think we got wrong or missed?
Not really in terms of got wrong, but just that maybe the framework would only apply to people who have societal impact as a major objective, and also define societal impact as system-wide impact. So there might be some investors who think, well, my responsibility is to change the behavior of the companies that I invest in. And you might think, well, isn't that a really narrow objective? Shouldn't investors try to change the world? But it might be some investors think, well, we can't boil the ocean. We can only affect the companies that we are able to hold stakes in. And some of them, a little bit more cynically, might realize that their clients will evaluate them according to the investments that they make. And so even if it's neutralized by other companies taking actions in the opposite direction, that doesn't affect their sustainability rating or reputation. And this is not because the investor is necessarily greenwashing, but they're responding to incentives. And what they realize is that how they're evaluated is according to the stocks that they do own, not the stocks that they don't.
Yeah, no, that is the very good points that you've made there. One of the things that we did in forming our conclusions was to review a lot of the academic evidence that existed around sustainable investing. And one of the reasons I particularly wanted to speak to you about this is to talk about this question of how to interpret academic evidence. And you've written extensively about this, including in your great recent book, May Contain Lies, about how we draw inferences from evidence. And certainly we drew on your work in how we went about analysing the evidence. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on a few of the issues we came up against. So first of all, we often see single academic studies quoted in support of a statement like sustainable investing delivers impact. But when you look into it, the study might be in quite a specific context and might not be very generalizable. How should practitioners think about the relevance of single studies versus a body of evidence, and how do they access the latter?
I think it's to recognize that these single studies are good on single issues, but they may not be generalizable. So let me first start by attacking one of my own studies. So one of my papers on sustainable investing looked at the link between employee satisfaction and long-term shareholder returns, and found that companies that treat their workers well, they do better in the long term. But there were some people who paraded this study and claimed that I had proven that ESG investing works. But I hadn't. I looked at one specific dimension of ESG, which is employee satisfaction. That doesn't necessarily translate into things like pollution affecting returns or climate change or biodiversity impact. And even my own study was focused on the US, and I since then expanded it to other countries worldwide. And while I found that it generally holds, it doesn't hold in all countries. In particular, if there's countries where there's labor market regulation, then given that regulation already protects employees, there's less of a role for companies to do this themselves through employee well-being programs. So I think the first thing is to understand the context of that specific study. Let me now move from this study to a study which is more on what you're looking at, Tom, with your paper with Harald on impact. And again, let me pick on a study which I like. So this is not being negative. This is a study that I accepted at the Review of Finance when I was an editor. And this was a study on the effect of ESG engagement on downside risk by Andreas Hüttner et al. And it's a very good paper in what they look at. They get data from one single anonymous investor with a good record of engagement, and they find that this reduces downside risk. There's nothing wrong with the study, which is why I wanted to publish it. However, this was a study on one specific investor with a good track record of engagement. Does this mean that we should get all investors to engage? And that seems to be the way in which the world is going. We rank asset managers according to their engagement. The more companies they meet with, the better. When actually, if your expertise is not in engagement, maybe engagement could be doing more harm than good because it leads to micromanagement. It's distracting the managers of the company from actually going ahead and running the company. And also this looks at downside risk. And it may well be that as a responsible investor, your goal is not just to look at downside risk, not doing harm, but active value creation. So my first book, I refer to this as growing the pie, not just ensuring the pie is split fairly. Are we going to encourage companies to make huge, bold, innovative decisions? Sometimes those bold decisions might come with downside risks because a new innovation could go wrong. But in the specific domain of studying downside risk, that paper is correct. Now, you asked about how do we access the broadest body of academic research, and that's a really important question, because what this highlights is that we should not base a decision on a single study. Because even if that study is absolutely accurate, it may well be that the study is quite narrow. So what we want to look at is the scientific consensus of an issue. And you can do this by reading systematic reviews. So we know in medicine, we have the Cochrane reviews, which take the general body of evidence, and more informally, on the NHS website, we will find the general consensus as to what causes a particular ailment and what the effectiveness of a particular drug is. We have similar things here in finance and economics. So there are some specific journals which will publish systematic reviews, like the Annual Review of Financial Economics, Foundations and Trends in Finance, or the Handbook of the Economics of Corporate Governance. Sometimes systematic reviews might be commissioned. For example, the CFA Society commissioned Pedro Matos, who is a leading academic researcher, to conduct a systematic review of the evidence on responsible investing. you yourself has conducted a systematic review of the evidence of impact in a broader academic paper looking at whether universal owners can really impact climate change. So we would try to look at general bodies of evidence rather than just one specific paper.
Yeah, okay. And so then the second issue we came up against, and this is one of the things that's really struck me as a practitioner coming into the academic field, but with a mathematical background, is that sometimes there's a big disconnect between statistical and economic significance. So what I've found reviewing the literature is the result may be found that's statistically significant, but economically almost completely irrelevant. And I mean, an example of that is one paper on impacts of sustainable investing found an effect that was significant, but when I worked through the regression tables and coefficient, it turned out that the effect equated in size to moving a company around 3 places up a ranking of 100 companies ranked in order of sustainability performance. So it wasn't nothing, but it was hardly a game changer. So how can we help practitioners understand the real world significance of some of these findings a bit better?
This is a really important point, and I think this is to highlight economic significance, not statistical significance. So right now, statistical significance is under attack from one main avenue, which is that you can data mine. So you can find something as statistically significant by running tons and tons of permutations and getting the one which happens to pass the threshold from statistical significance. But what you're highlighting is a different angle over which statistical significance is not enough. Even if something is statistically significant, it could be economically meaningful. So Andrei Schleifer, who is one of the most, well, I think the most cited economists of the modern generation, and he's sometimes known as the master of packaging. And this is in a very good way, not as a bad way in terms of that he's only good at marketing. What he recommends is that every abstract of an academic paper needs to have one number so that everybody can remember that number as being something of economic significance. For example, I can recite off the top of my head that Gomper's Ischian metric in their famous paper on corporate governance found that well-governed companies beat poorly governed companies by 8.5% per year because they cite that in the abstract. And that's something which is not just statistically significant, it's economically meaningful. If you can outperform by 8.5 percentage points, you're doing pretty well as a fund manager. And notice that sometimes that economic significance is important for the opposite reason. Sometimes numbers might not be too small, but they could be too large. And if they're so large, they could be just implausible.
Right.
It may well be that what you've measured is something which is not being measured correctly, or maybe there's omitted variables you fail to control for other stuff. So this real world sense check is very important. And this is why you mentioned that you as a practitioner come to these academic questions, because often academics will focus too much on statistical significance and won't ask common sense, is this something that a practitioner cares about in the real world and that a practitioner thinks is realistic and not just too large a number? And so we need to pay more attention on the magnitudes in order to try to understand, is this something which is plausible, but also something which is meaningful?
And then that brings you on to the third point I'd like your views on, which is this question of interpretation of evidence. And we've already discussed the fact that single papers don't provide comprehensive answers, but actually the reality is that the academic evidence overall rarely provides absolutely definitive answers. And in our review, we use the analogy of a mosaic, with each study being another tile, and gradually the picture becomes clearer. But the picture is only ever partial, and so there's always a need for us to develop a business judgment, if you like, based on the best we know. But the judgment itself generally won't be definitively provable. So what do you think's particularly important for us to bear in mind as we take this step from the best view we can get of the academic evidence to real world conclusions about how we act?
It's to recognize that studies are only a partial picture, not to put too much weight on a single study, and not to interpret that study in a black and white way. But we often do this because of our biases. So sometimes we have a view of the world, and we will interpret everything as supporting that view in a definitive manner. For example, diversity, which is something which is very important to people in sustainability. I obviously care about this myself. You have people who cite diversity studies saying this proves that diversity matters, or diversity improves performance, period. which is ironically the opposite of diversity. If you are claiming that there's only one possible outcome, then you're not open to different viewpoints. So sometimes we ourselves will overinterpret a study because of our confirmation bias. But, and I wish I wouldn't have to say the second point, but academics themselves may well be biased. So academics are people too, and they're prone to the same biases as the rest of us. And you might think that academics should be pure, because why did we enter this profession rather than a more lucrative profession? Is that we are really concerned about the dissemination and creation of knowledge. And maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I'd have a different viewpoint. But what I have seen increasingly, and what is worrying me, is academics sometimes are playing a bit fast and loose with the evidence, where you have some academics which have become extremely successful and influential, particularly on a topic like sustainability, where there is a strong view that the strong pressure to find that sustainability matters. They've had pretty flimsy papers, and even if those papers are overturned, they don't really have reputational damage. Why? Because people only will quote the original non-overturned study because that's what they want to be true. And this might be there also, even if the studies are peer reviewed. So I'm somebody who believes a lot in the peer review process. I highlight a lot of its benefits in the book May Contain Lies. I gave 6 years of my life to being a managing editor of an academic journal, but peer review itself might not be perfect. What are your incentives as a journal editor? You want papers that are cited, because your journal is evaluated according to its impact factor, and papers which find what the public wants to hear or what other academic wants to hear, those are papers which are most likely to be cited. Again, I wish I didn't have to say this, but I've seen this quite a lot with sustainability research. There are some really cited papers which are very flimsy, and often as a scrutinizing, discerning academic, you can highlight the mistakes. Often as a practitioner, you might understand that the way that they're measuring sustainability or the modeling assumptions that they're using are just completely not in line with how sustainability is practiced in the real world. What we've seen is some top journals which really have felt pressure to publish papers on sustainability, that even though the editors of those journals don't actually have expertise in sustainability, they are turning gatekeeper on these sustainability papers. If poor papers get published, then other papers will cite a particular assumption and say, well, this is the assumption made in this published and well-cited paper, and then this will then perpetrate, and then we end up getting quite a lot of papers on sustainability which are wrong or at best misleading.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of pitfalls, aren't there, here for practitioners in, who are wanting to gain insights from academic research. Are there any final points of advice that you would have for them when they're looking at interpreting academic research on sustainable investing?
I think it's to look at the person's credentials in sustainability. So because this is a hot topic nowadays, you do have some people jumping on the bandwagon and reinventing themselves as sustainability experts and writing on this, even though they've not got a long track record of expertise in this. So do they really understand sustainability issues? The answer might be no. And also you'd like the researchers to have some practitioner experience of sustainability to make sure that what they're modeling or what they're measuring is consistent with what is relevant for practice. And again, more generally, it's to make sure that you're not listening just to one particular person. People should not just follow my research, right? I have some views which are shaped by what I've done, but there might be other people who view sustainability in a different way from me. And what is great is there's a general body of scholars here who've done good research on sustainability. This is one thing that you're trying to explore with your ECGI conversation series. And hopefully by listening to a lot of people, we become more informed than just listening to our favorite ESG expert.
So for my last question, I'd like to come back to the opening question of this interview. Does sustainable investing work? What are the key areas where you think there's a need for more academic research to help us answer this?
I'd say where we need more research is not research on different topics, but research that finds different results. And so what do I mean by this? So there are papers which try to look at, does engagement work? And the only papers that I see published in academic journals are the ones that claim that it works, even though, as you say, their effects might be really small economically, or even though what they see as working is forcing companies to disclose rather than taking real actions. I see very few papers being published showing that engagement does not work. And this might be because of the incentives of journal editors, as I mentioned previously, to publish a study finding that investing does not work is unlikely to get as cited. And so this is something which my bias might be in existence, and I had to try to make sure that I was fair. So one of the final papers I published at the Review of Finance was a paper called Does Socially Responsible Investing Change Firm Behavior by Davidson Heath et al. And it finds that it doesn't. And there was nothing wrong. I thought this was a very good study. And so even though it gave a result that maybe people don't want to be true, that is not the bar for publication. The bar for publication is not whether we want the result to be true, but is the question important and is the methodology correct? And that's what I and the peer reviewers thought this paper crossed the bar. So I think it's not necessarily looking at different topics, but to allow for the topics which are currently explored to be published, even if the result is not something that we want to be true, rather than dressing up as being significant when economically it's small, or looking at a measure impact, which might be disclosure rather than real world changes.
Alex, thanks. That's been great to get your insights. Thanks so much for engaging with us on this topic. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much for interviewing me.